Welcome to Leadr Podcast, the ultimate destination for medtech insights, leadership inspiration, and the latest innovation. I'm Steph Pliha, founder of Tribe Agency and your host for Leadr Podcast.
Welcome to episode 11 of Leadr Podcast. Today we are joined by Chris Wood. He's the CEO of RevealDX and a visionary in medical imaging. With over 30 years of experience, Chris has founded groundbreaking companies like Confirma and Clario, transforming radiology software and workflow. So now at RevealDX, he's pioneering advancements in lung cancer diagnosis. Tune in as Chris shares insights on innovation and the future of medical technology in lung cancer. Let's tune in.
Welcome to Leadr Podcast. I am thrilled. This is our 11th episode, and I'm thrilled to have one of my favorite clients of all time, Chris Wood, who's the CEO of RevealDX. So Chris, welcome to Leadr Podcast.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Same. I know we always get to talk, from a client relationship, but it's nice to have you on Leadr Podcast. As you know, Leadr Podcast is specific for medtech, the industry of leaders and innovation. And so when I've been working with you, I really had the opportunity to learn what you guys are trying to do to this market, which we're going to get into. And I said, he's got to be on the podcast because people need to know what the innovations are occurring in this space. So let's talk about how we know each other really briefly. So as I mentioned, you're a client of mine, but I think we had originally met on LinkedIn, which is usually where I meet most of my clients. Do you remember the setting in which we met or how we met?
Well, yeah, I mean, you reached out on LinkedIn and I looked at your bio immediately and thought, yes, I'm destined to meet this person because I am in need of branding expertise and marketing expertise, as we go into the market here in the US, and was actually thinking, I'm not going to find somebody with the right background to bring on. And then I saw your bio and I'm like, oh, here's the person with the right background. I'm thrilled to be a client, and, we're about to enter the US market here. So we're going to be working closely together to pretty soon here to launch this thing.
Yeah. And I think when I first saw our LinkedIn engagement, I had shared it with our consultant, Alexis, who you've talked to. Mm-hmm. And both of us are from ION and have experience with this market and honestly started the market. So we have understanding of just how to approach the market, how they communicate in this market. And when I saw what you were trying to solve for, I thought this is a no-brainer for both of us. We should know each other, right? Yeah. We should meet and know each other in some place or capacity. So I'm glad that we were able to find middle ground, and I'm excited to have you guys as a client. Okay. So I really want to take the time to honor Reveal and just share what you're all trying to do with your company. And let's just start there. Let's talk about, how did Reveal come about?
I've been in radiology for a long time, over 30 years. And honestly, throughout that entire time, I've been hearing about and hearing from radiologists talk about lung nodules as findings in their chest CT exams. They find them all the time. There's a very low likelihood that they're lung cancer, but of course, lung cancer is a horrific disease. It has, you have terrible prognosis if you have lung cancer. So you want to catch it as early as possible. But there's an awful lot of these things, and only a small number are malignant. Mm-hmm. And they're just a big pain for the entire health system to deal with, right? And they always have been. And I had sold a prior company, and I was working at a PACS vendor who had bought my company. And at the same time, I was looking around for new opportunities in AI, and we'll talk about that later. Mm-hmm. And I ran across a company that was actually making a dent in this lung nodule problem. And because of COVID and a variety of other things, the company was for sale. Mm-hmm. So me and a few other folks bought all the assets of that company. And that's how I got involved. That happened in March of 2021.
Okay.
And the technology was great. They just were having a hard time commercializing it, partly because of COVID.
Right.
They couldn't finish their clinical study. And partly because of Brexit, honestly. They'd lost their CE mark because of Brexit.
Yeah. That's a hard time to start a company post-pandemic.
Yeah. So I figured we're going to go in and buy this thing. Mm-hmm. give the investors a stake in the new co. We're going to basically restart it.
Okay.
So, as I mentioned, I call myself a refounder, not the founder. The founder is Michael Calhoun. He had been working on this problem for years, PhD scientist type person. All the science was great. And it was just sitting there ready for somebody to commercialize. The market, like I said, the need has been around forever.
Yeah.
So I could just tell immediately that if we had something that worked, it would be a hit. And since then, we've done, over 1,500 patients. We've done a number of clinical studies, and it works.
Yeah.
So we're excited about that, that the product's performing really well. And it's not stumbling like a lot of the AI products have in the past few years on generalizability, on how much value they're bringing. We seem to bring a lot of value, and we seem to work everywhere.
Yeah.
So fingers crossed that continues to hold, and we can get it through the FDA and into the U.S. market here pretty quickly.
Lung cancer, as you mentioned, is the number one killer combined of all cancers. And it's a big problem to solve. I know when I was at Intuitive, they also referred to it as a very big problem to solve. And there are several unmet needs in that market. And I think what I learned through the years that I worked in this space is it's a continuum. It's a patient pathway from diagnosis all the way to treatment. And what I loved about your solution is it's that early diagnosis, not so much diagnosis, but early intervention on something that may have gotten put in the watchful waiting category or even just missed altogether. And so if you can talk about the technology that you have at Reveal and what you're hoping to accomplish with it.
Yeah, Intuitive Zion is a big part of this story because we've discovered these new biomarkers inside the CT image, which show you that specific nodules are at high risk. And the whole goal here is to try to catch cancer as early as possible. So if we do that, and the definitive diagnosis is, pathology, right? Biopsy. It's really good for us to have this robot downstream that can get to these small nodules, sample tissue, make a definitive diagnosis with low complication rates. Because the last thing you want to do is, start doing all these interventions on the lung and then drive up complications because they're expensive and they're quite dangerous. In that part of the body, they can be. So having that type of technology downstream from us and having us kind of triaging which nodules are especially dangerous so that the physicians can make informed decisions about when they want to go actually in and sample tissue, as opposed to it's not that they're guessing right now, but there's less objective measures that go into making that decision. And we're adding that information to help them make this decision better.
What is the specificity of your MSI score in early research, meaning the predictive value of your AI picked up this nodule on the scan, reported it as a high risk, sent it on? What is the percentage?
Right. And that's, the thing about a product like this is it really depends on which collection of patients you're looking at, right? Is this a patient who's a smoker for 30 years and, has other risk factors involved? And, because that person might have a small nodule, which already has a high risk.
Right.
But if you look sort of just in general, sort of broad terms across all nodules, we can take nodules that have, single digit percentage likelihood of malignancy and, bring it to double digit, 20, maybe 20% likelihood, right? Or 18% likelihood that this is malignant. Again, that's all based on what population this patient came from and what that prior probability is. But you really impact patient care. Because if you have a nodule that just, according to the guidelines, might have, much less than 1% likelihood of malignancy, you might tell the patient, just go home and don't worry about this thing. If you then run our software on it and it looks like it has double digit, maybe you have a 1 in 10, 1 in 5 chance of having cancer, you're definitely going to have that patient come back, right? You may not go directly to intervention at that point, but you're going to impress upon that patient that this is a more serious thing. They need to come back in 3 months, 6 months, or whatever whatever the care team decides. And that's how we accelerate diagnosis, right? Some of those intermediate nodules, which you might follow, you might decide for this particular patient, we're going to go in and sample tissue now, right? Instead of letting it grow a little bit. On the other side of the equation, you might have a moderate size nodule, and this patient isn't going to tolerate any surgery, right? Very well. So for that patient, if they have a low score with our product, it drives down the likelihood that that's malignant, and they might adjust care appropriately downward. Right. So this sort of upgrading and downgrading is kind of how we look at it. We don't look at it as a definitive diagnosis. It's not tissue.
Right. Yes.
Right. But
it's
it helps
flagging
you
those that should be further examined. Right.
Exactly. And really helps you with these decisions. And for these patients, these are tough decisions. I mean, generally patients who get lung cancer are generally older. A lot of them have comorbidities. They have emphysema, they have COPD. And going in and doing interventional procedures, we spend in the United States $1.2 billion a year on complications from lung procedures, right? So you don't want to do that willy-nilly. It's an important decision. It's probably made with the patient frequently. And having more data is just really valuable.
Right. And we kind of touched on this earlier, but, the old stat when I was with Intuitive, 70% of patients were coming in at stage 3 and 4 cancer, which there's not a lot you can do with those patients at that stage because it's gone beyond the origin of the cancer. And so the holy grail solution for all people in this fight is to get early and out, meaning identify it early, diagnosis early, remove it early.
Yeah, the ILCAP data that came out at RSNA last year shows that the 20-year survival rate, if it's caught at stage 1, is like 80%.
Right.
And this is just, data that's piling on to all these lung cancer studies that have come out, lung cancer screening studies, starting with NLST. And then, the ILCAP data is really long term. And look, there were confirmatory studies in Europe. Basically, lung cancer screening works. It's now reimbursed in the United States. Uptake has been relatively slow, but it's brought awareness to lung nodules. And I think this will grow over time. If you look at mammography, it took 8-10 years to get to that 60% screening number that we have now. So with a concerted effort, we can get people in for lung cancer screening, and we can catch even more of these things early.
Tell our audience, where do you envision that what's the call point? Who's the physician or caretaker that utilizes your system? And then where does that fit in the patient pathway?
Well, for our product based on its performance and characteristics, we really feel like this belongs in the hands of the radiologist initially when they find the nodule. Right at the time they find that nodule, whether through computer-aided detection or just their eyeballs. At that point, providing MSI, having them compute the MSI value. The radiologist has already determined this is a real nodule. It's not a false positive. It's not just, some anomaly. It's not something else. Computing this score is warranted, right? They compute the score. They put it in their report. Then that score is available to everyone downstream. And it also can help triage that patient to the right, referring physician, perhaps. I mean, maybe this person came in because they fell out of a tree. They have a nodule. They did a chest CT and then they find this nodule. They may want to refer that patient to a pulmonologist, thoracic surgeon, or oncologist. I mean, whoever.
Right.
And they might make that decision to sort of recommend that referral based upon MSI. So we want it really upstream. We want it right at the time the nodule is found.
Got it. That makes perfect sense. So both for incidentals and also for lung screening patients. Putting my brand hat on for a minute. I always look at, and when we work with clients, I always want to distill it down to what makes you best known, right? What makes you best in class? What's so unique about your approach that hasn't already been done, or you're doing it better, more cost effective, or clinically superior? So tell me about that. What's out there right now to solve for this problem? What's being utilized, and how does the onset of this, when it gets approved, improve the patient experience?
Yeah, I think we're the only company that's positioning ourselves as far upstream, right? So at the time the nodule is discovered. There are other products that are used kind of after the nodules discovered by radiology. For example, there's a proteomics-based blood test that is on the market. You have to run something called the Mayo calculator on the nodule, and if it passes that criteria, then you can send blood in from the patient. There is a product that looks at features of the nodule, kind of how we do, but it's also it's targeting tumor board, sort of downstream of radiology. So I think really our emphasis and the product really performs well, both on these small nodules and the intermediate ones upstream. And that part of the reason is, that it performs well. That's why we're putting it upstream. And also part of the reason is that we can have this big impact on patient care by finding these nodules, which normally might not be followed up at all. Or you tell the patient to come back, but it's probably nothing. They come back about, 50% of the time. Right.
Yeah.
So, if we push this upstream, we can actually have this really big impact. Some of our clinical data shows that for certain cohorts of patients, we can identify 40% of the malignant nodules, in these like screening cohorts, without an interval scan.
That's significant,
huge, right?
40%. So you're saying in these screening cohorts, you apply your product technology early on, and 40% of the time you're finding malignancy?
Yeah, 40% of the malignant tumors will identify them.
Wow.
Right. And yes, there are some false positives in there as well, but we also reduce false positives.
Right.
So the whole idea is being able to better triage where these small, intermediate, and big nodules go post radiology. And by doing that, we save a lot of money. There were studies back in 2017 that showed that a nodule that is followed up can cost like $3,500 to the health system. I mean, that's huge, given that they're found in about 30% or 40% of all scans. And the scan itself only costs like $180, right?
Right.
But then you're spending thousands of dollars, a third of the time to chase down these nodules.
Yeah.
I was out talking to a group of radiologists last week, and they said, oh yeah, we have patients come back 7-8 times. We CT scan them again and again and again, just following these things.
And not to mention the radiation exposure for patients that are having multiple scans. I mean, that's a whole other conversation to be had.
Yeah, CT's gotten a lot better in terms of reducing the dose, but certainly if you're doing 10 CTs on somebody, that's something to think about, right?
Yeah. So. One thing we skipped over, and it's just, I remember from my pulmonology days, and I think you had also brought it up with one of the key opinion leaders you guys are working with, but that, patient that used to go straight from an incidental or let's say a suspicious nodule in the down or in the upstream went straight to surgery. And I don't think it's a significant percentage, but I want to say it was around 20% were falsely operated on, meaning they got in to do a wedge resection. They did the wedge resection and they didn't have cancer. So they just removed a wedge of their lung unnecessarily.
Right. Most likely the patient was thrilled, right?
Right.
But because they got some really good news. But also the patient has side effects from that.
Right.
That they're going to have to deal with for the rest of their lives.
Right. Yeah.
And obviously we want to avoid those as much.
Significantly invasive procedure to find out that you really didn't need it. So I think all of those things considered, time, efficiency, cancer waits for no one, right? So every day is another day that the cancer grows. So speed and early and often are all of the goals of all people contributing to this market.
Right. And, cancers are all different, right? Prostate cancer, 5-year survivals in the high 90s, right? But lung cancer is a different story.
Absolutely.
There just haven't been advances in precision medicine. There are some coming down the pike, but nothing that give the 5-year survival, the type of numbers that you get even in breast cancer.
Right.
So you've got this combination, right? This sort of perfect storm of it's really hard to biopsy this tissue, but if you let it grow, your survival just goes down really quickly.
Right.
So what do you do? And like we discussed, having a robotic bronchoscopy helps, but it doesn't, it's, still not something you want to do on every patient who comes in with a nodule, right? That would be just prohibitively expensive. So our product fits right in that little spot. And, this was figured out by Michael Calhoun, who's the founder of the company.
Who's brilliant, by the way.
Yeah. And
I don't get intimidated by many people, but Michael is so smart that I am uncomfortable talking to him.
Well, I don't think that's his intention. You don't need to do that, or feel that way. But you need somebody who's got a big brain who can, take the right approach here. Because I think what we've seen in medical imaging, in 2015, it was sort of the genesis of medical imaging AI, right? At least the current generation of it. Because what happened in 2015 is that Jeffrey Hinton and a few other folks, they started getting performance in these object recognition challenges that was better than humans. So, Microsoft and a few other groups in 2015 published data, and they're like, we can outsurpass a human in recognizing objects in a scene. Well, that just kicked off $5 billion worth of investment into medical imaging AI. Yeah. You had Vinod Khosla 2 years later after that saying radiologists were going to be gone in 5 years, right? And you had a lot of this money kind of come in, and honestly, it was a lot of it was wasted. Like they took off the shelf algorithms in AWS or somewhere else and applied them to medical imaging, and they just didn't work. You need a founder and you need some technology that they can develop that's specific for healthcare, that works on patients, right? And isn't just off the shelf.
Right.
Because we spent $5 billion on this. We got 330 medical imaging AI applications through the FDA, which money can do, right?
Right.
But only 6 are reimbursed by insurance.
And probably even a smaller amount actually do what they say they're going to do, right?
Yes. I mean, and the thing is that if you train an algorithm using radiologists as ground truth, you're not going to surpass the performance of radiologists.
Right.
Right. And if you don't surpass the performance of those physicians, right, it's very difficult to justify paying additional money for that because you're already paying for the radiologist to read the exam.
Right.
So why should you pay more for something? What it ends up, a lot of these companies pivoted to sort of, we're going to make you faster. But, and a radiologist probably spends less than half their day actually reading. They're fielding calls from other physicians. They're, dealing with other patient issues, administrative issues, et cetera. So you might be able to cut a little bit of their read time down, but you don't impact any of that other part of their job.
Right.
So, efficiency is really hard to sell on for that reason. Right. And we decided that like I said, when we bought this company, we bought it not thinking, hey, we're going to make radiologists more efficient. We're going to help them pump through one more exam per day. Right. That's fine. That's what my last company did. Not with AI, but with workflow. And that's okay. But we wanted to go for something that was trained on actual ground truth and could potentially help radiologists perform better. That impacts downstream cost, that $3,500 that I mentioned, right? And that's the type of thing insurance will pay for. Right. And right now we have an NTAP code that pays $650 per nodule, which seems fair, right? Because you're saving $3,500 and
right.
You're doing it with $650, and you're also, having this positive impact on patient care and decision making.
Right. So when we first met, I was really intrigued because you are a serial entrepreneur. Tell me your origin story. How did you get into this lane? And, some could say you're a masochist if you're just only approaching startups. They're tough. I mean, startups are tough. The startup world, that's all we work with as well. It's a lot of long days, right? And you've got to know where the puck is headed and put your money on the right bet.
Right.
And so tell me about that. Tell me about your background, your experience, and, not only how you came to Reveal, but also just why you do what you do.
Well, I was born in the 60s, and, a lot of people born in the 60s remember this, the moon landing and, science and how exciting it was. So I was always intrigued and wanted to get into science. I ended up studying physics in college. And when I went to graduate school, I had really two choices. I could either get funded by building tracking systems for missiles, like missiles attacking missiles, basically. Or so go in sort of that Department of Defense route. Or there was this other program using NASA satellite image processing technology and trying to apply it to medical images. And that was a project Larry Clark was heading up at Moffitt Cancer Center, because I was at University of South Florida. And it was just a no-brainer for me. Instead of building, weapons, I thought this is going to be more fun,
right?
And maybe better for the world. I'm not sure. That's another discussion, I guess. But it just appealed to me. And then as soon as I started messing around with medical imaging, I just fell in love with it. I mean, it's ridiculously fun to look inside a patient's brain and, see inside their body. It's so valuable. Working at a cancer center, you see how imaging is just having this profound impact on patients, right? And we were right there. We were working in the Department of Nuclear Medicine, shuffling patients in and out every day and running software that we wrote that day, on them and helping them. So then I went into industry.
Sorry. The entirety of your startup experience has all been in imaging. Is that correct?
Yeah. So then I worked at Picker. I worked at an imaging company. But it was always in software. I started writing software for 3D visualization, and then we pivoted to image-guided surgery. And then I worked as one of the founders of a company called Confirma, which was based on some technology which was very similar to my graduate work. It was kind of early, pre-AI. It was pre-deep learning. But we did look at neural networks and other types of classifying systems, and then we deployed that. And we were the first company actually to get FDA clearance using a 510K for a computer-aided detection device.
Okay.
So it was early AI, like I said, pre-deep learning. And then that company grew, and we sold that to Merge Healthcare. I did get the startup bug there. Started another company to do radiology workflow. And that was a consequence of radiology shifting from film-based imaging to reading on computers.
Right.
There used to be somebody who would hang the films for you and decide.
I remember. Yeah, there used to be the big light boards.
The big light boards, yeah, the rolly light boards. There were people deciding who was going to read what. Now you gave radiologists a big list in front of them, and they got to pick which exam they were going to read next. So there was all these new dynamics like cherry picking and people staring at the list, waiting to read like another. So here you go. PACS is going to make people more efficient and better, and you're going to save a lot of money by not having film in the mix. But you've introduced this additional step of work for the radiologist. So we tried to minimize that. We found, and one of our customers actually found, that about 10% of a radiologist's day was spent figuring out what to read next. So we decided to build a smart system that would give them the next exam automatically, completely automatically if they wanted, or at least a very, very targeted specific list so they didn't have 1,000 exams to choose from.
Right.
They only had the ones that really were right for them in front of them. And we were able to make them, in some cases, 10%. The whole practice would get 10% more efficient. If you have 100 radiologists working in your practice and you get 10% more efficient, you've got 10 radiologists you no longer need to pay for. That's a big, big impact to the bottom line. And it's kind of wasted time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I would like to be 10% more efficient.
Yeah. Well, part of the genesis of that whole, serving up the next exam for them to read automatically. Mm-hmm. If you watch Netflix, right?
Always.
When you finish one episode,
it starts to show you the next one. Yes.
There's tons of data saying that you are way more likely to watch that next episode if it just starts automatically instead of having to go back and select it.
Of course.
Well, it's kind of the same idea, right? As a radiologist, you're kind of in the flow If you're just kind of allowed to stay in that flow and you don't have to get interrupted, go back and think about 100 different things.
Yeah.
You're able to be more efficient that way.
Given your diverse and wide experience in this space, what do you think is the next big thing in this industry, in imaging, and even in lung cancer?
And specifically in medical imaging AI, I mentioned this trigger, right? This technology trigger, which was deep learning, which, caused this massive flood of money in. I really think we're now sort of in this trough of disillusionment phase of the Gartner hype cycle, right? So, a lot of follow-on investment has dropped off for some of these companies. But what happens after that trough, right, is this slope of enlightenment, right? And then this plateau of productivity, right? And I think that's where the real money is made. A lot of money is wasted when you sort of push out a lot of capital into an industry thinking there's going to be some winners, right? But there's also going to be a lot of losers.
Yeah.
But once you kind of have your arms around the industry, you can kind of say, okay, this is what works. This is what doesn't. We need to build something that can get reimbursed, right? We need to maybe not focus on efficiency so much because we've kind of squeezed the radiologists a lot,
right,
as far as their efficiency goes. And we should start building products that actually add value in these kind of defined ways. And they will get reimbursed if they, are built that way. But they're harder to build. I mean, we've been working on this problem for, if you count Mindshare's days, 8 years, right? And we're just about to enter the market.
Yeah.
So these are hard to build. They take a lot of money to validate. And I think what's going to happen is that, medical imaging AI is going to sort of settle down a little bit, and we're going to start building real useful applications, and they'll just continue to add over time. AI will become more and more a part of radiology, but it's certainly not going to replace radiologists anytime soon.
Right.
That's the learning from this sort of all this hype over the past few years.
Yeah.
As far as diagnostic, lung cancer diagnosis, right now, circulating tumor DNA is not a technology that's ready. But I honestly think, with the data we're seeing on radiomics and what we can pull out of a radiology image, if we were able to combine that with some blood tests, either proteomic-based, circulating tumor DNA, any other marker, blood-based marker, we might be able to get our performance to bump up even more to the point where maybe you can even make more informed decisions about what to do. I'm not saying we're there yet, but we have seen some, in the US, but we have seen some posters in other countries where they're moving without tissue sampling directly towards treatment with radiation and other types of techniques for certain patients. Without actually sampling tissue, because there's enough confidence that this is a malignant nodule, right? That we're going to go ahead and treat this, even though we don't have tissue. And so I think ultimately that's where you want to make that your kind of North Star, where you've got such good data that you can say that nodule is malignant, that nodule is benign for these patients, or at least we have a high likelihood, and you're able to even tune these therapies even more. And then of course, if you follow this on, we accelerate diagnosis, right? Make it earlier and earlier. And then on the drug side, on the chemotherapy side, they get better and better also.
Right.
Then we get to a point where, maybe we can make a really big impact on lung cancer, because as you said, it's the biggest cancer killer by far. And, we can, if you were going to do a cancer moonshot, right, which is, the words that are being thrown around, you'd want to go right after early diagnosis of lung cancer.
Yep.
Right. That would be the biggest.
That's the name of the game. Yeah. And there's a lot of players in that, including you guys, to make that come to pass. And I'm hoping in my lifetime, I see that go more towards, like you said, the PSA or mammogram, where it's an early diagnosis, you have a very long life, maybe even fully recover. That is the end goal, I think, for anyone that's got a genuine interest in this market and in the lung cancer space. Yeah.
And unfortunately, we're not seeing lung cancer just go away if you eliminate smoking in the population. It's still there. It's still significant. Pollution, unfortunately, is, now becoming a big culprit.
Yeah.
So we really need to have better diagnosis and treatment of this disease.
We agree. 100% on that. All right. Well, let's move on to something around just this medtech space that we both live in. We do have CEOs and founders and maybe even people with an ideation, concept right now, and they're listening. So because you've done this multiple times, what is the advice you would give to your former self or someone that's listening, new CEO or founder of a medtech startup? What are the things that in hindsight you wish you would have known? And what are the tips and tricks that would make their life easier?
Well, there used to be this thing called a business plan, which nobody really does anymore. But I think from my perspective, the document I like to write or, create kind of as a living document that I always update is really the investment thesis. Sort of, again, putting yourself in the shoes of the investor, right? Why would they invest in this space? What's going on in the industry, in our industry specifically, that makes this a really good time to invest? I mean, are you at that peak of inflated expectations where you're going to throw a bunch of money in and it's probably going to go away, right? Are you, in a mature market, how much risk and how much time do you want to put into this? And part of our investment thesis is that we are kind of like a lab test, but we have the overhead of a software company. So, our reimbursement for our test is $650 by Medicare, and the AWS compute time required is 10 cents. Right. So when somebody says to me, well, why would I invest in your company? It's because of that. Why would you not invest in a medical device or diagnostic company? Well, if you want this thing to flip in a year, it's probably not the right investment.
Right.
Invest in the consumer space or invest in something else.
Right.
If you want your investment to grow over 40 years, maybe real estate, maybe the stock market. But if you have a portion of your portfolio that you want to do angel investing in, find a space that's ready and willing and, will accept capital and turn it into something meaningful. And what is your approach? Like for us, buying this company, buying Mindshare made a lot of sense to us, right? We didn't want to spend that 5 years that they had spent figuring this out, which took a lot of capital, right? Finding product market fit. We wanted to start at the commercialization phase. So we knew if we could find an asset that was for sale, that was addressing this type of problem that's reimbursable, that it would be the best investment you could make in medical imaging AI at a time when it's the right time to invest in medical imaging AI, past all the hype. And we feel like we can turn this around and sell the company in a reasonable amount of time. It's not going to, the last two companies that I built and sold took over 10 years. But this one, we had a 5-year head start.
Yeah.
So, I think that investment thesis is really key, and it kind of drives, a lot of what you do in the company.
Right. Especially early on.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't building HeartFlow, right? I mean, they raised $800 million or something, right? That's not the kind of investment that I'm interested in, or company I'm interested in running, right? Because the exit required to do an ROI for those investors is it's going to be very, very big, right? We know what we think we can sell our company for, and we think it's achievable in a reasonable amount of time, and we think we can, get 10x return for our investors. So, it all makes sense given the industry where it is, technology we have, et cetera. But we're not going to go out and just raise a big giant round. We're not going to, go after markets that maybe aren't developed yet, because, our investment thesis says that's not what we're doing. Right. So
I love that. I actually not considered it that way. You know that Tribe also does investor decks, and I think we're aligned on what's important. I know the thesis is more for internal preparation and prepping of, where you're going to go. But I think it's very much aligned with the investor deck. We take a very streamlined approach to it. Most people come to us with something. It's usually 40 to 50 slides. We get it down to 15 slides. We take a very similar approach that Shark Tank takes. You know, you give them what they need to know. And I think what you were talking about is really the key in our outline, which is not only why this company came about, which usually lends to the problem they're solving and the solution that they think they can provide, but it's the why now. That piece is missing from a lot of investor pitch decks. You know, why should I part with my money now? Why is this the time? Why is this the precipice of this market? And that is a big factor that investors take when they're looking at where they're going to invest their money.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people sort of just be too early and run out of cash because the market's not ready to accept them.
Right.
Look, right. If our product only had application in lung cancer screening, it'd be a lot more risky. Right. Because lung cancer screening is kind of, the adoption of it is kind of slow. Right. So it'd be more risky. Fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it, there's a lot of lung nodules found already in the United States, millions of them.
Yeah.
Right. Thousands per day are being found. So there's already a place where we can apply our technology. We don't have to wait for the market to evolve. The market is asking for it now. There's no huge hurdle in that there's, you know, the FDA has approved a lot of these devices. So we're confident we can get through the FDA, but we're also confident we can get paid, like the reimbursed by insurance because of this downstream impact we have. All of those things are required to make this a good business. And we're at the point now where we've sort of checked almost all those boxes. And we're in the market in the EU. We've got customers up and running over there. But it's really the US market that's going to make the company kind of take off.
Right. So we are looking at this kind of holistic market, but I think one of the things that you had an eye on or a pulse on is something that you call knowing your customer's customer. So can you tell me about that and how that applies to Reveal?
Yeah, well, I think it's something that I've tried to apply to almost to every company that I've been involved with. And that is that, you know, working in radiology, one of the things I realized very quickly is that radiologists are providing a service for other physicians, right? So what I've always tried to do is get an understanding of what that other physician really wants. And then building something like that is really easy for the radiologist to use. So in the first company, you know, breast cancer company, one of the things that we found that breast surgeons really wanted, they wanted to know what is the volume of this lesion, because they're going to go in and resect it. They want to know, if I put a 1 centimeter margin around this thing, how much tissue do I need to take out? We built those tools with a small amount of input by radiologists, but we built them for their customer. So then we delivered it to the radiologists. They started using it. They liked it. They had never really provided a lot of other tools like that, information like that to their referrings, because it was really hard for them to get. We made it super easy for them to get that. They put it in their report, and then they get praise from the surgeons that they're delivering this report to, and it makes us look good as a customer or as a software vendor, right? So knowing our customer's customer and the product that they want puts us in a better light in the eyes of the radiologist. And you know,
and it makes their process to sell downstream easier, because you're really meeting the need not only of the radiologist but of everyone downstream. Right? Yeah,
you will get a radiologist's attention if you say your thoracic surgeons will really like this information. Right. Your pulmonologist will really like it if you provide this information. They will check with their pulmonologist. But if that is validated, then you have a much easier time talking to them about buying something for them to use. And this is one of the reasons why we have thoracic surgeons on our board of medical advisors. We have even an emergency physician who orders a lot of CTs of the chest. We have pulmonologists on our board. And we, of course, have radiologists. Our chief medical officer is a radiologist. But we also are very aware of the whole space. Because they exist kind of I think of radiology, they used to call him the doctor's doctor, right? And for a reason, because those types of collaborative care team type approaches, radiology tends to kind of be at the center of that.
Yeah. I think lung cancer, and I can't speak for all the other cancers. I didn't work that closely in all the other cancers, but in lung cancer, I worked very closely for about 3 years. It feels, and I don't know if we were a part of creating this, but it feels very community-based, meaning they all work in concert, starting at the tumor board and all the way through for that patient, the lung screening nurse, the nurse navigator, the director of the oncology department, the thoracic surgeon, the interventional pulmonologist, the radiologist, the interventional radiologist, all of them have a hand in the patient. And I think that the sooner you learn that as a medical manufacturer, that it's not just going to serve a radiology need, you have to be really respectful of the entire patient pathway. And if everyone's aligned on that being a good fit for every part of that pathway, then that's when you're working with gas, right? You've got something that everyone wants to get behind. Everyone's putting their fist on the desk of the CEO at the hospital and saying, we absolutely need to implement this in our hospital. It meets all the needs. It works with our pathway. It'll improve efficiencies, et cetera. I wanted to highlight too, if it's not already in your pro forma or in your Vestor deck, there's a paper, and I cannot remember who, I can send it to you after this, but there's a paper that quantified the cost to a hospital of late stage diagnosis. Have you seen this?
Maybe not the specific one you're talking about.
I'll send it to you. The reason I bring it up is because we talk about early diagnosis, but what does it look like if you don't get to that patient early? And what does it really look like for the hospital administrators that are making all of these decisions, right? Capital decisions, software decisions, efficiency decisions. And when you really look at the cost, the burden, if they get these patients in at stage 3 and 4, it is significant. It is significant, far more than $600, right?
Right.
And so I think that has to definitely come into play. Getting to them early has a price implication or a cost implication. And then also there's the downstream revenue that returns because that patient was able to be operated on. That resection is on Medicare's fee schedule, and it's quite significant. So if you're able to flip someone from maybe they were going to be a stage 3 or 4, you found them early, now they're a stage 1, you can operate and resect on those patients that were probably missed until they became a stage 3 and 4. So there's so much money math that needs to go on in this space that, just needs to be regarded. Getting early with your aid and even robotic bronchoscopy's aid has a massive impact. Patients don't need to have unnecessary surgery. Patients get surgery early so that they can remove their cancer. And, the last one we were just talking about, patients won't have to wait to have a diagnosis. So they don't come in late and burden the cost of the hospital. So just because we live in this world, both of us, and we know it really well. All right. So I have 3 final questions that I ask every speaker. It wouldn't be fair if I didn't ask you. All right. So number 1, and this can kind of just be a speed round, who I believe wholeheartedly in mentors. I have great mentors in my life and I'm grateful and thankful for all of them. But who would you call a mentor in your life and maybe want to give a shout out to, and why?
Yeah. I mean, when you sent me this question, the first person that popped into my head was a guy named Steve Brin, who I worked with at my last company before this one. He was quite good at many things in business, right? Raising capital. He's a lawyer. He knew quite a bit, but it was really sort of the empathy and the curiosity and sort of this compassionate side of Steve that made him exceptional, right? Because you can have all the knowledge in the world, but if people don't want to work with you, right? Or if people have a hard time working with you or can't go to you for help, you're not a good leader, right? Yeah. And I think a good leader somebody who leads with curiosity, somebody who leads with empathy, and is always there to kind of be a sounding board and to help you.
Yeah.
It's just essential for leadership.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of leadership. Hence I started a leadership podcast. But I think the 2 things that you were describing, he's got emotional intelligence, and then he's also sounds like a servant leader. You know, he's obviously very compassionate and empathetic towards his people and is genuinely curious and interested in them. So those two things are like the magic recipe for great leadership. If you can.
Yeah. And you can work on those things. Like, you know, I wasn't really trained to do that type, to focus on those things in business.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it is important to kind of separate a little bit business from leadership. Yeah. And to say, okay, there is this sort of emotional, high EQ component that you do need to work on. First of all, because it's just good for you as a human.
Right.
And
for
second
stress
of all,
relief.
it does make you better at your job.
Yes. Yes. Everyone has one. They may have many, but what is the one that comes to mind that is quantifiable to be your superpower?
I don't know how quantifiable it is, but, you know, we talked a little bit about putting ourselves in the shoes of the referring physician or somebody else, and understanding their perspective. I actually think one of the things I work on and hopefully I've gotten pretty good at is putting myself in the other person's shoes, whether it's a potential customer, whether it's an investor, like we were talking about before, trying to understand what their goals are. Instead of pushing out your ideas, trying to genuinely see if there's a good fit between what they're after and what you're providing.
I love that. All right. I know I had said to give me your top 5 leadership books. It really doesn't even have to be a leadership book, just a business book, but you can just give me your top one that everyone should read if they haven't already.
Well, I put together 5.
Okay, give me 5.
Question in advance, so I'll give them to you quickly.
Okay.
And some of them aren't really business books. The first 2 aren't. First one is Nudge. It's by Richard Thaler, and it basically shows you how, you know, people think, and how their decisions are influenced quite a bit by little tiny things, like what is the default, where things are on your shelf when you're shopping, you know, where your eyeballs go. It kind of gives you insight into how people are making decisions. And honestly, it gave me some insight into how radiologists make decisions. If one little piece of information can influence what they write in their report, right? And we've all seen studies that show that certain times of the day, radiologists might make more errors than other times of the day. But there's also these little nudges that happen that impact performance in medicine.
Kind of reminds me of the book Blink, similar.
Yeah. And on that same theme is Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman's book. I would recommend everybody in business to read that. One that isn't very popular, probably, and but I think is important if you're going to do a startup, is a book called Startup Boards by Brad Feld. Trying to get your arms around a board meeting is hard. It's a really hard thing to do. So just even for therapy, reading about how boards are difficult and how there is an art to them is important. Your last guest, I listened to your podcast, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, Ben Horowitz's book, from Andreessen Horowitz. Unbelievably good book. He's so honest in that book about what it really is like to run a startup. And then the last one is the No Rules Rules, Reed Hastings' book on Netflix and the culture of reinvention. He did a great job in there. If you don't want to read the whole book, I think everybody should go out and find the Netflix culture deck. It's about 100 slides. And it's just amazing. Right?
Are they known for I don't know much about like the company of Netflix. I'm just a big consumer of it. Are they known for their culture? Yeah.
And they give an awful lot of power and authority to people who are fairly low down on the org chart. And they have done that to great success. They've also had to, think about Netflix. They started out as a company that was mailing CDs back.
Right. They were like the red box in the grocery store, right?
Yeah.
Didn't they start out that way?
That's how they started. They did it through the mail, and then they reinvented themselves as an online service. And then they've reinvented themselves as a producer of films and content. Right. And reading through this book, you can see how they sort of specifically designed the culture so that they could do that reinvention. A lot of times what happens is when companies get to a certain size, they realize it's really hard to train people. And they start putting together rules and regulations. There's 1,000 rules and steps you need to go through to make a decision. And what happens is companies atrophy.
Yeah.
And they get less nimble. And all of a sudden, startups eat their lunch.
Yeah.
Right? This last book that I mentioned here, they specifically designed their company so that it wouldn't happen. And for quite a while, they were successful. Maybe you could argue that they're not quite as nimble as they used to be, but for quite a while, they were able to keep that culture of reinvention and invention. And for example, their policy on travel, right, wasn't 30 pages long. It was do what's best for the company.
I love that. That's the one book I'm going to read immediately, because I love a good pivot story. I love companies that are nimble, even if they're not, but they act as if they are. I think I learned that from Intuitive. Intuitive will never say no to anything, that makes sense for the business and that also will move them forward. So they're not so set in their ways on bureaucracy, or we can't do that, or we didn't have that in the plan this year. If it makes sense for the business, they will find a way.
Yeah, and I think it's important to realize that that's valuable, and that if you don't do anything to sort of foster that culture, that this sort of atrophy will happen automatically.
Right.
That will happen by itself. But if you want to prevent it, you actually need to take steps to prevent it. And
not only atrophy, but apathy of your employees. If they're working for a tired company that really hasn't been innovative and they are not ahead of the pulse, you're getting passed up by other companies. Blockbuster got passed up by Netflix, and it was obviously very depressing to people that were working at Blockbuster. They probably half of them hopped to Netflix. But yeah, I love a good pivot story. I love seeing people innovate, and I love the idea of their culture really breeds that. So that's awesome.
Well, there you
read
go.
That book for sure. Well, Chris, it's the end of the road for us today. It has been a pleasure having you on. It's nice to get to just talk to you. I know most of the time we're talking, it's very transactional, trying to get things done, vice versa. So it's a nice opportunity to slow down and really reflect on what you're doing. Nice.
Yeah. I hit the subscribe button, so now I'm a avid listener.
You must have a kid. Smash that subscribe button.
Right.
My 11-year-old laughs at on YouTube. See that bell right there? Smash that subscribe button. Anyway, well, it's great to see you. I hope that you have something fun planned for the weekend with the fam, maybe a Disneyland trip or something.
Not Disneyland, but because Seattle, you don't leave in the summer.
That's
true. Right here.
Okay. All right. So that's the one time the sun shines.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right. Well, good to talk to you.